Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome if you're following us online via video conferencing. I'm really delighted today to welcome Alessio Patalano, a professor at King's College London, co-director of the Center for Strategic Studies at King's College, and he's a well-recognized specialist in various fields. With him, I was discussing, he's going to give his presentation in English, but he very kindly agreed to answer in French after that for the Q&A. He speaks French fully. In particular, he was a student here at INALCO and EHESS, which is a prologue to what I'm going to say. He's a specialist of Japan's military history. More broadly, he's a recognized specialist of naval strategy, in particular in Southeast Asia and in the
Yes. Mm, mm,
in the Asia Pacific region, although he's since expanded his academic studies to European defense issues and aspects of great strategy. In his background, there has been alternating shifts between academic studies, the breadth and diversity of which you will appreciate, including the understanding of the Japanese world and its history, but also academic research and strategic advice given in particular as part of consultations and discussions with the authorities of various countries. And of course, the United Kingdom, Italy, because you served on the at the at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, your birth country, and you also teach at the Australian War College.
yeah.
There are also some more operational implications and contacts with the military world, the armed forces. I'm not just going to mention your wife's name, who was as the SGDSN, and she was in the French Air Force. She's not here tonight, but please pass my warmest regards to her. But you also taught at the Joint Service Command and Staff College in the UK. That's very interesting because with very well noticed thoughts about naval strategy and the maritime domain, as you're going to mention, you have dovetailed professional experience, not just in academia, but also in the professional, diplomatic, and military fields, which is very often the case of the people whom we invite to this cycle of lectures. I'm not going to name all your work anyway. You know, the information is online on our website. You'll have a much more detailed biography of tonight's speaker as well as his work. I would just like to mention the book published by Georgetown University Press in 2023, The New Era of Naval Power in the Indo-Pacific. Also mentioning papers that were well noticed because that was not the dominant feature of the Ukrainian conflict, but specifically the role of actions from land to sea or at sea in access or access denial strategies to the Black Sea, both for Ukrainians who scored several goals against the Russian fleet, but also the issue of traffic and supply in the region. Maybe there will be questions about this. And people spoke about your thoughts on the Taiwan issue and straits more generally. And so that opens up the possibilities for questions from the floor later. I'll give you the floor. Earlier on, I explained the rules of the game. You have as long as you want for your presentation, and then I will respond to that. We might have a discussion together and then questions from the floor, always giving priority to students' questions and then the entire room. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and its very kind introduction. It's always nice personally to come back to Paris because, as we talked about earlier, this is a place that is very dear to my heart because I started my academic career here in Paris as a student at INALCO first on Japanese contemporary history, but also when I came back for my postgrad at EHESS. That was really the beginning of my academic research. So, as we said earlier, I'm happy to take questions in French later for those of you who want to engage me in French informally, but
Is
for reasons that have to do with the fact that some of the goal of this session is to challenge everybody. My challenge to you originally is to give some of my lecture in English. So, as we said, we can then come back to French. And secondly, if possible, I will stand so that I can engage everyone, including people at the back.
I'll switch in English now, and hopefully that won't be too much of a challenge. This project is part of this talk tonight is part of a project that I've started about a year and a half ago. And this is very much part of what we were discussing earlier, of that sort of crossover between academic work and, if you want, a broader engagement with military and civilian institutions in the realm of defense. Because one of the very significant topics that has emerged, certainly in the practice of sub-threshold activities, the exercise of coercion, has been to try to exploit vulnerabilities in advanced economies to undermine the political will to pursue particular and specific foreign policy objectives. And whilst, if I were to tell you right now about the South China Sea, the Straits of Taiwan, or the East China Sea, the so-called gray zone activities would be something that certainly you've probably heard about in more ways than one. What is perhaps less known, though, is that this type of sub-threshold coercive activities have started to expand also in the undersea domain. In particular, critical undersea infrastructure, which is part of the broader critical maritime infrastructure, has become, over the last few years, certainly with an acceleration since 2022, and in particular in light of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, has become a much more central part of the way in which countries like Russia, like China, conduct themselves in that sub-threshold coercive space. And so this project really comes from an observation that this type of challenge was becoming much more central in military debates. It was being recognized in the national security circles, certainly in the UK, that's the case, but more broadly across Europe, and certainly here in France. I think it was Amiral Gautier who was the first one to start to talk about the French approach to seabed warfare, and Amiral Vageron has been very much at the forefront of that conversation since he took on at the helm of the French Navy. And so, again, Italy, Norway, Finland, Sweden, countries that have been at the receiving end of malicious activities from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. So the question really is, as this type of activity becomes more prominent, what it is that drives actors, state actors like Russia, to try to take advantage of it. And so tonight, this talk is if you want me running by you all, right? What is a live project? And actually, the main publication out of this project is on its way to be submitted for peer review over the next month or so. So this is a really important moment for me to sort of test the logic behind the talk. And I want to start really, as I was mentioning earlier on, with something that became very apparent shortly before Christmas. This is last November. The Secretary of State for Defence in the UK, John Healey, took the time to deliver a conference press in which he highlighted that the UK was monitoring the activities of the Russian ship Yanta, which is a spy ship. It's an intelligence and information collection ship. And it was very interesting the way he phrased and he presented that to the public. He was very clear about the fact, we know what you're doing. We're looking and we're watching what you're doing. And depending on how you decided to conduct yourself, we'll take actions as a consequence. He was trying to do so in order to reduce that space that allows those who want to exploit vulnerabilities to take advantage of critical undersea infrastructure. And what the Yanta was doing was, first and foremost, mapping the position of undersea data communication cables around the UK. Now, as I was saying earlier, this topic is certainly a topic that, as a way of context, has been well recognized, certainly in the last couple of years. So to my left, that's a snapshot of the latest UK national security strategy that was published in June 2025. And as you can see, this is page 12. It's literally the first page that is defining what is the core of UK homeland security. Now, of course, as an island nation, right, homeland starts at sea. And in particular, the point that the strategy was trying to make is that there is a fundamental shift in the way in which our economies fuel modern development and therefore underwrite this so-called social contract, right, at the national level. And that kind of extended dependency, it's really what is creating the appeal for those who want to undermine our political will to conduct ourselves in international affairs. And these were images that were published when the Defense Secretary was mentioning the Yanta. The Yanta is actually that ship over there. I must say, it's not a bit of a looker. It's not very pretty. When you think about, sort of challenge at sea, you think about this beautiful big warships. These days, that is a bit of a sort of a secondary thing because the main space of contestation in international affairs is certainly moving more closely into not facing someone else's military capability, but try to undermine the economic solvency of the country itself. And you might ask why that is the case. The answer is there. 99% of UK international data goes through undersea cable. That totals roughly 65 billion of UK economic activity, basically about the entire collective of British financial transactions on a daily basis takes place through cables. And in particular, because of the sensitive nature of the type of data, there's only specific type of cables that are used. And it's a bit of a small thing, but if you see the little box there, box number 2, that is the space between the northern part of Cornwall into Wales and Ireland. That's where most of the landing, particularly the bits sort of towards Cornwall, that's where the super fast fiber optic cables that connect the UK to New York and the East Coast are located. That is also where there's the largest concentration of financial and economic related data, which from a UK perspective are particularly significant. So when you see a ship like the Yanta sort of going up and down in that space, you have to start sort of being concerned worried, as it were. So that's the context. That's where the project is coming from. But what I want to do with you tonight is to position through the students in the room or the PhDs in the room. What I'll try to do is a classic sort of academic trick number one, right? So first thing, position the topic into a broader debate. What is the debate? There is a debate over critical undersea infrastructure protection. As a matter of fact, there are three parallel ways to look at it. There is the historical approach to it, which fundamentally deals with the conduct of operations against critical undersea infrastructure. Then you have the maritime security literature, which is the one that was sort of emerging in the mid-2010 and really focused on governance issue. Because of course, cables start and end and they go through high seas. So most of it cannot be dealt in terms of protection by a single country. And like most maritime security issues, so the literature goes, critical undersea infrastructure has to be approached as a governance problem, right? We have to think about the ways that different states can come together and deal with the type of problem. And then there is a third literature that is much more regionally focused, is the one that predominantly uses cases from the Indo-Pacific region, that is trying to link how, yes, maritime security scholars are right? It's governance, if you want international governance and cooperation is essential to ensure the protection of critical undersea infrastructure. But in the context of the geopolitics of the US-China competition, what is happening in reality is that a number of countries, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, are not just going for governance, they're going for governance that allows them to have closer ties with either the United States or China. Now, what is interesting is that within this debate, there isn't much talk. This debate that is about presents the problem of CUI, critical undersea infrastructure protection, as a problem of risk, right, of mitigating risks. It doesn't cover at all state-sponsored malicious intent. That's a threat. It's a different kind of action. So part of what I'll try to do is to position this work into that debate by trying to bring back, particularly from a framework perspective, the balance between risk and threats to critical undersea infrastructure, which at the moment is very unbalanced towards looking at critical undersea infrastructure as a problem of risk management and resilience. From that, I'll try to introduce a framework to reconcile that gap. And then for those of you who are less familiar with what exactly it is that it looks like, critical undersea infrastructure, I'll talk about the character and how the character defines the boundaries of that sense of threats, potential threats to them and vulnerabilities. And then focus on the specific challenges unfolding from the character of CUI before drawing some general conclusions. So let's start with the context, right? The first bit. Honestly, by now, this should be kind of easy because critical undersea infrastructure as a general topic, it's not a new thing. It's been around for a long time, right? The first cables had been actually laid between in the Channel, between France and Britain. And then from there, quickly by the mid-1870s, they were reaching the coast of the United States. The British and the French empires were the first one to actually start seeing the importance of cable connectivity, particularly in terms of telecommunication cables, because as you can imagine, it enhanced the capacity to bring the empire together and present it as a much more sort of tightly connected network than at any time before that. What is interesting is actually that the very first action of World War I, certainly from a UK perspective, literally the first opening operation was conducted by this ship. Again, not a looker, not a very pretty thing. As a matter of fact, this is a paddle steamer. So on bad weather conditions, not really a nice place to be on either. But HMTS, as it was known during the war, Alert, was the first cable laying ship. It was also the first ship that was equipped with very big scissors to cut cables. And it was deployed in the very early stages of, in 1914, of the war, to basically go after every single German cable in the channel in order to fundamentally limit the ability to communicate with the external world, and in particular with German possessions beyond Europe. How do we know this? We know this because there is a very significant literature that covers this, and it looks at the importance during wartime of operations against critical undersea infrastructure, but also failure to pursue operations against critical undersea infrastructure. In some respects, the wartime-focused literature on critical undersea infrastructure is particularly significant because in some respect helped us correcting what was a really important topic that until the late 1980s was literally out of sight, not just physically, but also intellectually, in the dynamics and our understanding of the war. Here I'm talking about the Zimmermann telegram, which is the first study that looks at how the British ability to access information and secret cable-related information that Germany conveyed to supporters in the United States that were trying to keep the Americans out of the war, enabled the British to tell the Americans, look, this is happening, what do you think about it? And it's a book that really sort of changed in many respects some elements, some key elements of our understanding of why the United States debates before entering the war changed and what made it change. Nexus, which was published just a few years ago, is the flip side of that coin, is how the United States observed in awe what the British could do with their operations against undersea telecommunications, and how that the strategic impact of acquiring superiority in the critical undersea infrastructure space became genuinely, by the end of the war, an obsession with the US Navy and within the US military, and one that gained considerable amount of priority. But what's interesting about all of that, this literature is very much about wartime control. And in many respects, wartime control, it's when all the bets are off. Frankly, even from a legal perspective, you verge into the law naval warfare and a lot more of things you can do in that space than when you are in peacetime. When it comes to active malicious intent, operation conducted against critical undersea infrastructure, in peacetime, we have very limited literature on it. Most of it, as I was mentioning earlier on, comes from the maritime security and the international, for the students of international relations, it's the securitization sort of school of international affairs, right? Predominantly anchored in the Copenhagen School of International Relations and focusing very much on this idea that this is all about resilience. Because after all, it is true that the majority of the challenges to and problems with critical undersea infrastructure actually is not state-generated. Statistically speaking, about 80% of all incidents happening to undersea data cable, pipelines, or electricity cables, they are generated by anchors, fishing nets, sharks. I mean, some cables are kind of small, so sharks can actually, right? It's easier, right? So a lot of it, but that 90%, it's not the bit that is problematic. And I'll come back to this in a minute. It's the remaining 10% that is very problematic. And so this literature really doesn't really look at that. And we know from instances of the last 4 years that this is not just a peripheral problem. is not just a European problem that has emerged in the aftermath of the Russian full-scale operations in Ukraine in 2022. This is actually becoming a global trend. It so happens that actually the modus operandi of some of these activities that have been identified in the Indo-Pacific region have very close similarity with some of the activities conducted in the Baltic. Some say the Chinese, of course, are neutral in. Sorry, I can't keep a straight face when I say that. I like to call it active neutrality, right? But there is a very strange similarity between some of the instances in the Baltic and some of the instances taking place in the Indo-Pacific. So it is a real phenomenon in that sense. And it is about that peace storm contestation, right? So that's the context about this particular sort of piece of work. And again, keep on the back of your mind the fundamental questions that I'll try to come back to at the end. Why does this all matter? Because I think it does. It is very important. But how do we get to the answer to that question? So let me get to the framework, right? This is about the only theoretical moment. So give me this 2.5. No, I'm joking, I'm lying. It's 5 minutes, okay? Give me 5 minutes, right, to lay out a brilliant new theory, and then we get that out and we go back to sharks eating cables, okay? Bear with me. Not just the sharks. The three main sort of elements to understand as to why we need a different type of framework and why that 10% that I mentioned earlier matters, right? That 10% of instances that have malicious state-sponsored intent has to do with these three factors. One, the 21st century is what I would call the maritime century, right? Now, you can be cheeky and you say, like, yeah, but every century is maritime, right? Ever since people started to go at sea fishing, right? And from there going somewhere else, pretty much, I mean, literally globalization exists because of shipping. Literally, right? So every century to an extent, except the 21st century is the first in which the oceans, not just as a source of food, right? Or as a platform for connection, right? Taking things from point A to point B, right? So that physical connectivity, yeah? But also because of that digital connectivity that literally our lives depend upon. That's why it's a maritime century. Again, almost the entirety of global data connection rests upon signal. You know, when I always tell my students that when you are looking for signal, all right, you shouldn't do like this, you should do like this, all right? The cloud isn't really the cloud, it's the deep in many ways. It's only when it lands ashore that you start looking for, right? For the antennas. But until that point, it's a pretty maritime thing. All right? How do we know this? Because a number of instances, like 2017, Somalia, 2022, Tonga. Now, of course, the UK, France is in Somalia, thankfully, in some respects, right? But hear me out. Countries that have or rest upon fewer cable for their own connectivity are the best example to give you a sense of how much that matters in our lives. In 2017, when the main cable of data that goes into Somalia, and in January 2022 with Tonga it was exactly the same thing, was severed, not because of malicious intent. In one case was a fishing anchor, in the other one was a volcano. Okay, it was both of them therefore are sort of non-malicious generated instances. In both cases, the economic damage and the shaking of the fabric of societies was absolutely deep. Somalia lost the majority of its daily financial and economic income for the better part of the month until the cable connectivity was not re-established. Tonga, that in part has also a healthcare system that depends on data, people could not go to their GP for their appointments. It gets to that kind of basic level, right? In the UK, if we had a major data disruption, for the first time, we wouldn't be able to complain about the health service because the people cannot run it, right? It's just that the data will not be there and you will know. I mean, my daily life, it wouldn't make a difference because getting an appointment with a GP, it's harder than invading a medium-sized country these days. But besides that, that change of the relationship between the sea and modern societies, in which it's not about just that physical connectivity, but digital connectivity as well, I think is the reason why we can talk about this century as a particularly maritime inclined century. And one in which that sense of enhanced connectivity that is part of our daily life is unlikely to change that dynamic. In fact, as we move forward, the only limitation to a continuous expansion of that dependency is whether and to what extent we can build data centers large enough to contain and manage data. But the more we do that, the more the dependency will remain as such. This is also creating widening forms of state control in the maritime space, right? The third element is technology, and the maritime domain as a general proposition is a technology-intensive environment. Technologies today are enabling us to access the oceans and to use the ocean to expand infrastructure in the ocean in ways that it was just unimaginable even 10 years ago. You have to understand that by 2040, we will have doubled the amount of general infrastructure that is sea-based. Just to give you another sort of data point so that we can put this in context, only insofar as data cable is concerned, down to 2007, we had about worldwide about 100,000 kilometers of data cable, okay? So from the beginning of 1851 to 2007, you got 100,000 kilometers. Between 2007 and 2024, that number increased to almost 400,000 kilometers. That's right. You tripled the total in less than 20 years. Currently, there is a considerable number of high, fast, reliable link data cables that are being either built, laid actually, or commissioned between now and 2028. So that number will continue to grow. Technology is allowing state actors and private actors to actually access and use the oceans in this new enhanced form of connectivity in ways that it was impossible. Imagine that in the 1970s, when the third conference on what became known as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the technical bodies had some of the most cutting-edge scientists and engineers providing the technical expertise for those who were drafting the content of UNCLOS. Now, these were the best minds of the day, by a long shot. And they had absolutely no idea that within 40 years, we would be able to double the distances at which we can go to the deep end of the ocean. So in that sense, today we live in a world in which that dependency on the ocean by a combination of the expansion of that digital connectivity and the general moving of infrastructure in the ocean and the capacity of state actors in particular to operate and act in that space has reached levels that have never been experienced until literally 10 years ago. What does that mean from a framework perspective? So that's the thing I wanted to remember about, right? Most of it, it's what I call the 6 factors of influence in the relationship that defines modern societies and the ocean. The two sides of the hexagon, as it were, the ocean as a resource, the ocean as a source of connectivity, these are well-known aspects of it. That's always been the case, right? The interesting element of the story here is only that UNCLOS, when it entered into force in the 1990s, it really expanded coastal states' control over the capacity to access and exploit the content, particularly seabed within the territorial waters and then the ocean itself. You know that at sea, you only own your seabed within the sort of the continental shelf and then basically within the sort of main territorial space, but you don't own the water. Fish don't come with passport, right? I mean, between France and the UK, we could sort of go down there. We might want to have passports, but you know, it's not that I stop cod in Scotland. It's like, are you British or Norwegian? I say, I'm from Iceland. So in that sense, UNCLOS expanded sort of maritime exploitation and legal control, redefined the boundaries. And with those also duties and responsibilities of coastal states and any other user of the ocean. So that bit is expanding in that sense. But, you know, the traditional strategic uses of the ocean from a state perspective, projection at sea, or denial of that, sea control and sea denial, and in more recent times with the application of nuclear weapons in the maritime space, strategic deterrence. This stuff, it's always been kind of there. That's one of the traditional uses. What I think really is happening now with the expansion of, in particular, critical undersea infrastructure, is that there is a link or a space in between the exercise of sea control and legal control, which I call seabed control. States have a capacity to exert, from a technical point of view, potentially, as well as a legal point of view, a greater sort of, if you want, control, literally, over aspects of the oceans, particularly in relation to the seabed and the critical infrastructure on it, in a way that it was not possible before. It's where the strategic dimension of the uses of the ocean meets the legal dimension that UNCLOS brought about. And by the way, the reason why you have the hexagon industrial baseline on the other side is that what really draws a distinction between those who can and those who cannot literally is just the access to the type of know-how and technological capacity. That's what draws the line and the difference. That's why some countries, certainly in Europe and in the United States and in parts of East Asia, have a greater potential in terms of their ability to exploit the undersea and the seabed, but also weaponize that space and turn it against others. And our dependence on it makes it such that it is a genuine vulnerability of modern society, and one upon which we will increasingly depend more. Right, done. So this was a little bit more than 5 minutes. I lied deeply, but I hope that the rest of it is going to be easier to follow. So let's talk about a character, because we talked about, I talked about critical undersea infrastructure for like 20 minutes now, a bit more actually, and still haven't shown a picture. So let's do it. Right. So you have different type of cables, but fundamentally you've got three types. So critical undersea infrastructure has three main, if you want, typologies, broadly speaking. You've got pipelines, all pipelines. These are the hardest to build and the hardest to repair. Also, the ones that if you break it, it's going to cost you a lot more and take a much longer to get it fixed. You've got data, telecommunication cables, and then you've got electricity cables. Now, data cables are the most important, but also, as things stand, the most vulnerable as well. Or pipelines are very vulnerable, but data cable, given the importance of the stuff, it's a lot, as I said, you can drag your anchor, sharks not really, but they are this big. So it's not a particularly sort of large piece of equipment that you have to disrupt. But what I wanted to sort of highlight here is how worldwide, what is interesting is that not only there is the connection, right, the vulnerability because of our dependence, but it's also the location. Cables, like maritime shipping lanes, tend to follow the logic of the fastest, most direct, shallowest, when possible, route. Why? Because it makes it easier, in case there's a problem, to repair them. But it also increases the exposure and the vulnerability. There are parts of narrower passages, like in parts of Bab el-Mandeb, particularly around choke points, where you don't need particular equipment. You need good divers with good diving equipment, and you can actually bring harm to critical undersea infrastructure. So it's relatively sort of easy access in that respect. And as I say, what is interesting as well is that the majority, if you put fishing and anchors, which are the main sources, that's the majority. So most of it is not really sort of malicious in that sense. And in fact, it happens every day, constantly, at every given point in time, on a daily basis. There is some cable that is going to be repaired because there's been some sort of disruption or interruption to it. So the other thing is also, and this is a part of what the literature has covered very well, not only cables, their vulnerability is about the reasons that we depend upon them and the physical constitution and their location, but also who owns the companies and equipment to actually lay cables. Now, good news, France is at the very top of the list, yippee, right? After the United States and then Japan. With China, that was fast catching up. And then about 7-8 years ago, legislation in the United States made it impossible. Particularly, who do you think are the largest users and the ones that pay for the most of the cables that have been laid? Data companies, so Facebook, Meta, right? Google, because they depend, that's their life, depends upon it. And most of them are headquarters in the United States. And in light of the problem that was highlighted with the interference with cable, then Chinese companies were banned from operating in the United States. And that's been the case. So hence why the Chinese curve slows down a bit. But what I want to draw your attention to is that even though that is the macro picture, the mini picture, the localized picture, the regional picture tends to change. Because if you look at the Indo-Pacific, Japan, which in the previous graph was not one of the dominant sort of actors in this space, actually in the Indo-Pacific is one of the most significant actors together with China, right? So in that sense, there is a significant amount, as I said, industrial baseline capacity to maintain this type of capabilities is one of the factors that enhances your ability to potentially shield yourself from problems. So if I were to bring it all together about the character of critical undersea infrastructure so that we can move towards answering the essay question of why does it all matter, there's three things that is important to remind ourselves of. Number one, critical undersea infrastructure is a very complex ecosystem. It includes a very different typologies of infrastructure, and some of them are more resilient than others. The other thing is also that because of the different types, you tend to, rather than rely on just a few, to lay more and more. Cable laying itself is a very competitive endeavor and has become an increasingly more competitive endeavor, which means that there are countries that have greater leverage than others, particularly those who can headquarters companies that will then in turn provide the services for the laying and the repair of cables. Mind you, at any given point in time, right, there is a very limited number of suppliers of services to service cable worldwide. So far, we have absolutely no idea in a situation of a tense crisis or sustained crisis, systematic attacks against or interference with critical undersea infrastructure. We have no idea whether we will be able to repair it at a speed that limits the negative economic impact of that action to begin with, right? The last thing is the geography of undersea cables enhances that sense of vulnerability. So if you weren't convinced by what I've said so far, I think again, because the simple fact that it's easier than interfering, if you want, with that aspects of social life, definitely that makes it particularly sort of interesting. So based on the character, what can we say about the challenge that we're looking at? Okay, so this, I don't know, actually this looks better there. There's different, when it comes to threat more than risk, there's different type. What I want to draw your attention to is particularly the sort of the gray zone threats, sabotage, cyber operation, espionage, incursions. This isn't just about disruption. This is also interfering with the infrastructure itself in order to gain an advantage, an edge over others. That's an additional element that makes this particular appealing. As we speak, there might very well be cables that are under surveillance of potential hostile actors, and we may not know about it because and it is really harder to monitor the structure, the network, and it is really harder to detect until you actually see suspicious kind of activity being conducted around it. This is a very good example. I think the Eastlink 2, the one that happened on Boxing Day, 26th of December 2024. Can you imagine everybody in Finland sort of having fists? And then all of a sudden, like, you know, internet is not working. I mean, I don't know about you, but if that happened in my house, there would be like, you know, massive rebellion. The kids would take control. The world would come to an end very quickly. Civilization would be put on notice. But Eastlink is really interesting because it's actually the only case that we have in recent times that we know from beginning to end, including the police investigation as well as whether it would extend, there was if you want, a pursuit, pressing charges, as it were. And what we know from that is that part of the challenge in protecting critical undersea infrastructure is that attribution is really complicated, right? Unless you genuinely catch, there are ways to do it. I'm happy to talk about it because part of the project that is not here, it's spending a lot of time looking at the signals that ship emit, ping out, particularly suspicious vessels that we know because they are either under sanctions or they are under double flags or stateless. So you follow them, and then over a long period of time, you can trace patterns. And then when you compare these different ships, you have an idea of the type of patterns that you want to look out for in order to get a sense as to whether you can attribute to that ship a particular malicious endeavor. But that being said, it's not an exact science, and it's not the type of science that can be easily sorted in a standard court of law. In fact, one of the very interesting things it is happening in France, it's happening in Italy, it's been happening in Finland, in the UK, is to try to develop legislation to close the gaps and so that we can make attribution easier to be identified and pursued legally. But so far, what we learned from the Eastlink cable disruption is that literally you can mostly go after the captain and part of the crew members. Mostly as a borderline, like a dangerous behavior. It's like health and safety. Like, naughty, you shouldn't be doing this, right? You should pay attention. Even though you know it's a state-sponsored, or there is a good sense of certainty around it, unfortunately, the political cost of calling someone out at the moment outweighs the advantage of doing so. In particular, in Eastlink 2, there were patterns. Now, the latest sort of the picture over there is part of a giveaway. There's other ships that I've been monitoring around the UK. You can actually see that for a number of hours over a repeated number of days, these ships slow down massively. So a standard sort of a tanker would probably do 8 to 10 knots, right? 8 knots is probably the normal. When they start slowing down to 2 to 3 knots and stop doing on straight lines, but they start going back and forth, then you start thinking like, yeah, do you really need to do that? Maybe not. The problem is that you have to know when that starts happening, and then you have to sort of keep tracking. But this kind of zigzag, or sort of going over and over very small areas, portion of a particular space, is always a good indicator of a potentially suspicious endeavor. So what are the challenges? First, this isn't just about cutting a cable, right? There's multiple potential objectives around interfering, if you want, with critical undersea infrastructure. One is general interference, disruption, which could be temporary, or indeed, in times of war, as I mentioned at the very beginning, destruction itself. But particularly interference, really hard to detect unless you have the necessary capabilities, either undersea capabilities or monitoring capacity to actually follow ships or what is happening under the surface. Attribution as a result of that is also relatively difficult because it's always harder to establish prima facie whether it is an accident, criminal activity, or a state-sanctioned activity. The last one has, at the moment, a particularly high threshold for being recognized, and as a result, hasn't really happened yet. There's also limited legislation, in particular in linking discovery, investigation, and prosecution. But as I was mentioning earlier, France, Italy, Finland, UK, in Europe are certainly leading from the front in terms of trying to close that gap. And then capabilities. There's a difference here between issues of resilience, issues of defense, and indeed the opposite, offense. What do I mean by that? You can't monitor everything at every point in time, every day. And the problem with critical undersea infrastructure, because of how pervasive it is in our lives, and therefore how that vulnerability is persistent, the challenge is that it cannot be just a military task. On a daily basis, 75%, if not more, of incidents are just incidents. So you can't have the military doing the whole of the way. That's a resilience problem. It's about having the capacity in the private sector to actually deploy, repair, and bring back online. There's only the defense aspect, whether there is a malicious intent. But then again, it's a really large space. How do you draw a distinction between resilience and defense? And of course, the next step is, if you have the capabilities to do defense, do you actually want to develop the capabilities to conduct offensive operations in a fashion that is not too dissimilar to that of adversarial powers trying to do to you? So what? And this is where we're drawing this to a close. And I am almost on time, which is almost unprecedented. So it's a remarkable achievement. If you didn't like the talk, I'm going to be happy just because I almost managed to keep it on time. Just kidding, all right? Your happiness is my top priority. I can sell this stuff, yeah. No, I can sell ice to Eskimos, as they say. I do think that, so what? Why does this all matter? I think it matters because the protection of critical undersea infrastructure is how national political will is tested these days. It's because of how it affects our daily lives. It's actually a very primary soft target. It's easy to access. It allows you to have different options. It's not just about cutting a cable or blowing up a pipeline. You can do a number of different things. That panoply of options, each having serious consequences at the receiving end, it's why it's so appealing, right? It's why it matters to look at that protection. Uh, and in particular, because most of the undersea domain is the intersection of different layers of legal responsibility, it also makes it for an important test of cohesiveness across partners. The very first instance, or when we're talking about the Nord Stream or the East Link, I remember I was interviewing the chief of the Finnish Navy about this. And I remember that he said, like, look, none of us knew exactly what was happening, but I had the phone numbers of my counterparts and we just started to talk, right? Because otherwise it's a really complex type of endeavor, and certainly not an endeavor that you can leave just to one single entity at the national level, or indeed within a state. If it is a criminal activity, is it a naval responsibility? Is it a military responsibility? Or is it the responsibility of private actors? If it is an incident, it's for someone else to repair. If it is a criminal activity and you haven't really established, shouldn't therefore police, or if you have coast guards or countries that have just navies with coast guards being part of it, sort of being deployed in a military sense? Every different country will have a slightly different answer to this problem because the arrangement institutionally is very different. But with greater access, as we project into the future, the greater expansion of critical infrastructure at sea, we are likely to have a larger number of stakeholders. So as a result of that, I think it's going to become even more appealing for others to try to test our resolves in that space, because just ascertaining what it is, whose job it is to look after that, and how to get their job done is going to be a complicated affair. And of course, the other thing is that those who have a greater technological edge will have a larger or wider set of options at their disposal. Notwithstanding the fact that in some places a diver will just do. So what do we do about it? And this is where I leave you with a couple of thoughts. First of all, first thing that I always say, it sounds like the most obvious point to make, but you'd be surprised how many countries in Europe and indeed worldwide that depend heavily on the maritime dimension of the national economy do not have a national maritime security strategy. Now, you know, we're all continental here, so French, Italian, we like our writing. We have beautiful languages. I'm saying this, but in the UK, it's the same thing. You know, in the UK, in 10 years, we've done 7 different national strategies. 7. One every 18 months. We spend more time writing than actually doing anything about it. Because you don't have the time. You're about to do something. It's like, oh, there's a new one to write. All right. Write a new one. Yeah? So in Europe, we like our writing. But there aren't that many, actually, that have comprehensive national security strategies. Now, why that is important? Because that creates a shared understanding of the problem across different departments. It clarifies responsibilities and empowers actors to act upon them. I think the second thing to do is to clarify also the vocabulary and the grammar of critical undersea infrastructure protection. We are still in the early stages. If you leave it to the militaries, everything will be seabed warfare. Most of it isn't. And for as much, you know, I'm a huge naval person, so hey, if I'll die in the ditch or give more money to the Navy, but the truth of the matter is, not all of it is a securitized or a militarized matter, right? But we need to have a better vocabulary to catch that. There's a difference between seabed control, which is about owning the control of your own space, and that speaks to resilience. There's a different thing about seabed warfare, which is about defense and offense, on what you do along the seabed, in your space, and potentially against adversaries. And then there is undersea security, which is about the predominantly environmental aspects, right? Fastest way not to have sharks eating your cables is not killing the sharks, right? We want to protect the sharks. But so there is an empowerment that we're missing because the vocabulary is still in its infancy. And again, developing a method of protection is the third thing. If you have a strategy, if you have the right vocabulary and the grammar, then it's going to be easier to identify methods, how to make a choice of what you want to do, right? Whether it is about resilience, defense, to what extent you want to do a mix of both, to what extent you can do only one. For my money, any economy, any major economy moving forward should do a significant investment into the resilience of its critical undersea infrastructure and try to work with others to ensure that that is the case. That's the baseline, right? And last, enable collective action, right? In Europe, the only sort of big case that I can think of is the virtual regional maritime traffic center, which is based in Rome and is about sharing information of the movement of shipping. We have, and this really about monitoring bad things from happening in navigational terms. It's a legacy of the sort of counter-terrorism years. We've got nothing of that equivalent in the critical undersea infrastructure space. Now, mind you, it's easier said than done, because cables are a sensible thing. Infrastructure is a sensible thing. You don't want to share it with everybody. But at the same time, if we are very serious about enhancing our capacity to protect them, especially in the sort of defense space, then we need to be able to have create a better enablement of collective action. This is the end of it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers time in a minute. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Alessio.
Thank you, yeah, Alessio. A couple of questions to you. Mentioned the underwater dimension. It's a doubly overt form of warfare. It's a bit like cybersecurity, where you cannot allocate responsibilities. There are some uncertainties. But what is important for Europeans is to have appropriate operators. And if you look at the list of the major international operators, you have many Chinese, of course. You have a couple of Americans, but not many Europeans. France, in fact, and that is the Defense Department thought about this. For major industrialists, it made little sense to sell a company that laid cable, and yet 80% of it was purchased by the French state. So you may have private players, but if the states are not present, if the states do not control operators, well then, of course, there is some uncertainty. Also, the question is also raised as to how to protect the laying of the cables themselves. And so there are issues of maritime and underwater security over and beyond the concerns expressed by states. I mean, you saw the example of the UK that produced so many strategies, but are we witnessing a sort of European convergence on this matter of security, the protection of the laying operations, the protection of operators, and the way in which these operations are conducted? A second question in line with the first one, and this applies to France, which, as you know, has a huge exclusive maritime zone. Can you have a maritime or underwater security strategy without some minimum of consistency with the general strategy, defense strategy? I mean, we do have a sort of maritime strategy with a limited number of ships, mostly deployed. Well, we have a few frigates, a few submarines, a few ships here and there, a few aircraft carriers, but that's about it. And then the third question is the Arctic. We didn't look after Greenland because questions were raised and then new answers were provided. But there's also Russian interference out there. In particular, a cable was interfered with. But of course, there may be an optic fiber cable bringing, connecting a number of countries, Japan, Finland, Norway. Is this going to happen? And then, of course, about this, the Arctic area, you have not just a matter of maritime communication and telecom, of course, with undersea cables, but that space is not organized at all. There's no legal organization of that space, unlike other parts of the world, because the standard borders, territorial areas are pretty much dictated by the melting of the ice cap. Antarctica as well, although you have fewer people concerned. No cables there, but you could well imagine that that might cover the area with cables as well. Anyway, that was for starters. Well, thank you so very much. These are important points. There are two types of balances. If you're looking at the general taxonomy, if in terms of European convergence, there is a balance between private and public players. And of course, France was maybe faster than other countries because it was necessary for France to gather the wherewithal. But the same doesn't apply everywhere. So you have to strike the right balance between, in the US, of course, the situation is quite different. Google, Meta, OpenAI have their own integrated service. They do everything from A to Z. Europe is different. And that raises the issue. As I said, we have to strike the right balance between private and public players. But then, of course, you have to recognize that all this has bearing on the country's economic life. And so there's necessarily some European convergence. I mean, there's a European strategy looking at investment, the need to have and to maintain underwater infrastructure. Nonetheless, you have to keep some elasticity because domestically, each country should be in a position to decide its own governance. That's one thing. And then you need to strike the right balance between the need for cooperation, because, of course, when you have an issue, it doesn't end on the territorial water of this or that country. But then you will have technological differences between countries. And you saw that with the Virtual Regional Maritime Traffic Center. That's the only kind of cooperation on such sensitive maritime issues where the capacity to share information is no greater than that of the weakest link of the chain. You may have Italy, Spain, Britain, but of course the benchmarking is that of the weakest link. I mean, the countries that are still running on Windows 98, they will be the lowest common denominator, as it were. So there's a technical dimension there, and that makes things rather difficult, and that is what makes cooperation challenging. And then the opposite is also true. You have countries that have sophisticated technologies, and they tend not to share this with others because they have an advantage, a competitive edge, a strategic edge in terms of national security. So, of course, they will be tempted to keep this to themselves. So what I would like to say there is that there may well be two
types of challenges there. The one on European or international cooperation at large, and the tension between a small number of countries that are in a position to share because they have similar technologies, and on the other side, on the other end, the need to keep weaker countries in the conversation. And that's what you have in the Indo-Pacific with the South Pacific Islands.
Et l'autre type de défi.
And the other type of challenge is how we can find this balance at the national level between private and public sector players and enable this type of balance so that it becomes compatible with supranational cooperation. And tonight I was talking about Finland, Italy, and France because the three countries have started developing different but compatible types of legislation. And I think that this is, well, it's very good for a master's thesis, a comparative analysis of the various European countries and their approach to the management of these issues is a good thesis subject because it's fundamental to identify how far we can go in terms of cooperation for this subject. Secondly, resources. Well, the matter of resources is very important, but there's a big difference between countries like France, in particular, the UK, because here also there's a specific tension between the development of new technologies and the ability and the political will to share the application of some types of new technologies with somebody else. But in this context, what is very interesting is that, well, first, sorry. Let's backtrack a little bit. Don't touch the aircraft carrier. Don't touch the carrier battle groups, okay? Right. Nuclear submarines and so on and so forth. If you want to have a discussion about aircraft carriers, I'd be glad to have that. But we should avoid going into a binary conversation in which either you do one thing or you do the other. In the maritime spaces of today, we can see that right now in the Middle East. Military projection capabilities abroad in maritime spaces is becoming a fundamental aspect again in terms of foreign policy. It's not a political point, it's an observation of facts. So in this context, although the goal of my presentation was to say that you need to think about subsea infrastructure, but in this context, this is where we have technological responses and resources so that we can move faster without necessarily reducing the importance of the elements of state power manifestations in the maritime realm. When it comes to AI-powered gliding systems, these are drone surface systems or underwater systems that you put in the water. They have pre-established motion patterns and they can do some monitoring that maritime forces would not be able to do otherwise. For instance, in the UK, the Helsing company has developed the LURA system, which is the first undersea glider system that's being developed by the UK Navy with the Australian Navy, and the idea is to leave that in the water. It's small, it's 2 meters in size. It's like a small torpedo, a tiny shark, coming back to sharks, but a small 2-meter shark. I saw it, it's tiny. But the technological aspect is that the miniaturization of systems is such that it can compress a lot of data, and so it can map out the bottom of the sea and sometimes go back to the surface, transmit data, and then dive back. So regarding resources, I think, and means, I think that technologically advanced countries have a relative advantage to develop capabilities to improve their maritime domain awareness, as it were. That said, I think that in terms of cooperation, it's important to talk about means. But the maritime topic is one that can bring more to European countries compared to countries that have major economic exclusive areas but don't have the resources to monitor them carefully. On that, I was involved in a program with the UNDP in Fiji 2 years ago. Yes, that's nice. That's nice. Well, that's why I'm a maritime expert. Really, really. Yes. Yes, objectively, of course, there are no bad places when you're a maritime expert. But Fiji, that's the country with the biggest coral chain in the world. In the world. And also, it needs more fundamental surveying, seabed surveying capabilities. They can't go below 100 meters. So with support from the UK government, they invested to help Fiji develop their survey capabilities to bring it down to 200 meters. But most of the environment to be protected is in fact in between 150 and 250 meters. So if you think about small drones that are going to provide info about the Russians, but if you're in a Pacific archipelago with an environmental aspect that's fundamental to your economy, it makes a world of difference. So in terms of cooperation, I think that we've got means in Europe that are not to be underestimated, and that could be supported more in terms of international cooperation. Now, moving on to my last question, that of the Arctic. The Arctic is more difficult because it is colder. This is not a region that I'm a deep expert of. I'm fond of warm areas, but more seriously, there's something fundamental about the Arctic. The change in the setup in the Arctic means that by 2045 or 2050, it could be difficult to apply the Arctic treaties. And once the Arctic Treaty is called into question because the areas have opened up, well, that's really the next boundary in terms of geopolitical challenges. The contestation that we can see now in the South China Sea for the definition of maritime boundaries, you'll have that even more in the Arctic, especially related to the fact that the Russian population is not going to double before it happens. And so there will be huge coastal areas that won't be immensely populated. And so there will be potential exposure to other actors that are going to replace the local population and gain more weight, geopolitically speaking, because of the change in the situation. Here we're talking about China. China is already developing the economic and industrial part of the Russian coast on the Pacific side. And there's no reason why there shouldn't be a similar move to the Arctic. And I'm not convinced that even if the geographical change is going to change the coastline, well, still there will be a lot of glaciers and icebergs. So I don't think that there will be an immediate change in the shipping routes, but there will be a geopolitical legal challenge and also the state's ability to project force in this area, because submarines and maritime equipment can use this area more quickly than commercial ships. There will be too much risk for commercial ships unless you've got a nuclear icebreaker. But since there will be more free water and free ice, it will be shorter than going through the Red Sea or Moose. But the number of days that are going to be saved on one hand won't necessarily be offset by lower insurance premiums or the geopolitical security of having your commercial routes transit via these routes. It's mostly a strategic matter at two levels. The change in the political geometry, if you can no longer apply the Arctic Treaty in the definition of boundaries, and also the ability that Russia and China will have uh, to assert themselves vis-a-vis North America and Europe. So I will now open the cycle of questions. Please raise your hand high, students first, and I won't forget the internet if there are any questions from the chat. Ely is a former student, and he will be a lifelong student. Please start. Yes, you, sir. Another student. And who else? Yes. Ely, please, first. Thank you, Alessio, for this stimulating and insightful presentation as usual. I had two quick questions. The first one, listening to you about data and connectivity aspects, of course, I can't help but think of a comparison with what we're hearing from space specialists who are more or less saying the same thing as you, saying that by 2040, all of connectivity won't come from land but from space. No. No. But anyway, the question is about the complementarity in the boom in space connectivity with the boom in subsea connectivity. We can see that both are happening at the same time, so there's no competition really, but if you could develop, expand on that, and also what are the similarities and divergences. And another thing, we haven't really talked a lot about energy in the sea underwater infrastructure aspects in the next few years. Offshore wind power cables, of course, you were talking about it, but offshore wind turbines and also water-cooled servers that would be placed underwater, because what's good with subsea infrastructure is that it's naturally cooled, and so that's another threat and a new mode of action. Thank you, Eli. Please give the microphone to the person here. No. Thank you for the presentation. I simply had a question about the 10% lower than 1,000 meters. So what means are used to have that mode of occurrence? Yes, another question from students. Please give them a microphone. Yes, here at the center. Good evening. I have a question from the web, two questions in particular. The first one is, what is the role of undersea drones in sabotage of cables? And secondly, the cable laying ships, there are easy targets in wartime. What are the protection measures that are imagined in high intensity conflicts? Thank you. I'll address the last two questions because they are quicker. Well, beyond 1,000 meters of depth, these are mostly breaks or issues with use and sea conditions. That's not necessarily anchors or other types of ruptures related to maritime activities themselves. It's the fact that cable maintenance, especially cables, because energy pipelines normally they're in shallower waters. So here we're mostly talking about power cables and data cables, and especially data cables that are not necessarily very thick or resilient to difficult conditions. to the temperature or the waves. So I was also struck by the 10%. I thought it was a lot, but if you've got 400,000 kilometers of cables, then that becomes more reasonable to think that there are such maintenance problems. When it comes to drones, drones are very important. You can already see that now. Whether in, oh, I don't have a picture. No, I don't have a picture. On another slide, I've got a picture of the type of boats and tools, means that are used for subsea maintenance and especially for activities below 1,000 meters. But here, the laying companies do that themselves because they know exactly where the cables are. And so it's easier for them to monitor. And usually you come here with drones, ROVs, remote operated vehicles, to do the maintenance. And we also know that drones are rather useful for interference with cables. And that's also a reason why in the US, at some point, there were quite a few concerns about the fact that in China now, especially for deep seabed research, even some universities, especially the Oceanographic Research Center at Beijing University, have drones that can operate up to 2,000 meters of depth. There are other under unmanned vehicles that can go down to 4,000 or 5,000 meters. And so major technological capabilities. And since they're used for repairs now, it's not difficult to imagine that you could also use them for other more nefarious activities. Cable laying ships, yes. In wartime, in war conditions, it's not just about cable repair ships. They themselves, on their own, you would end up in a context where maritime activities will be part of a network in which the coordination of resources for this high sea research is fundamental. And here now, technologically, we're developing technological means, what the Americans are calling distributed lethality. So more and more, you separate the brain from the muscles, so to speak. So don't just think about one warship. If you can see one warship next to something, it's okay. If there isn't a warship next to your um, boats, it's a problem. No, it's a whole meshed network that is fundamental to identify targets, but also identify what needs to be protected at sea. But it's not an absolute science, but nothing's an absolute science at sea. On Friday, I was on a boat that had just concluded exercises, the Lafayette and Orion exercises in the Atlantic. They had sea state 7 at some point, and I can tell you that at sea state 7, staying on the boat is a problem. You can have any technology in the world, but still, when you're at sea, when you're in the maritime realm, the number one challenge is the maritime realm itself, not the enemy. It's being able to go from point A to point B and do everything you want in the meantime. But it's not an absolute science. It will always be a problem with targets, but at the same time, there's a major change in the maritime space, especially in strategic terms, going from what was called a platform-centric environment, so boats, to a network of effectors, which is a horrible term, but that gives the idea that it's not just about one boat, but an entire structure. So a cable repair boat would be part of a broader system that would be defended within the network. Now, the issue of data. Yes, I fully agree. There's a big difference. Well, here, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I was in Australia with Qatar Airways, and for the first time, I was on a plane with Starlink. And so you're thinking, no, it's horrible because you're still working. Well, but at the same time, it was remarkable. There was tremendous continuity, but the data exchange was limited, the density of data was limited, and that's the real difference. That's not something that you're going to have in huge amounts in space. The big difference between subsea cables and space data is the density and continuity and speed of data. It's not the same at all. And especially continuity and density. And since you're moving in a direction in which data centers and the use of AI will require more and more density, I don't think that this type of difference will shift. That will extend to space, of course, quite clearly, because if you look at what he wants to put data centers in space, right? But, well, clearly there will be a shift in direction. Yes, for cooling. Well, the same logic. That will tend to reduce the existing gap, but when it comes to trust in continuity and density of data, you can't compare what's going through cables with what's in space. So that's the big difference. But still, where I fully agree is that when it comes to similarities, it is true that there are a lot of similarities in terms of legislation, in terms of coordination between different parts of government and vulnerability. But there the difference is that whereas cables, although we're going to try and create more density in the number of cables, it will never be as in space, because with low Earth orbit satellite systems, you can place a lot of small satellites in orbit, which normally should give more redundancy, which you don't necessarily have with subsea cables. But at the same time, the vulnerability element, and therefore the relevance for an adversary to take something hostage, is the same. Yet, attributing something in space is easier than at sea, because once there's a trajectory, you can always retrace a trajectory in space, whereas it's more difficult at sea if you're not there at the right moment. So compared to what's happening in the underwater environment, it's stealth by design, and it's more opaque. Therefore, being more opaque, it is a more interesting option than space. Or for different reasons, they are developing missile, hypersonic, and normal capabilities for detection and monitoring that you can't find in the underwater environment. That's the difference to me. And that also gives an advantage, especially for a hostile actor, to identify that as a preferable element compared to another hostile environment. And what is essential is to avoid having a binary narrative. It's space dominance or underwater dominance. But for fiscal reasons, it's always the case.
Kovlev.
All right, we'll have a general question with Olev, and then I believe there was another question. You're also standing up. Yeah, just like the students. Yeah, I'm a retired general, so I'm supposed to stand up. Regarding this matter of resilience, I may have missed something. I mean, it was really exciting, and I followed with great interest. But there's one nagging matter of resilience. If you look at the number of cables, and there are new cables every day, you say, well, if you cut the cable, we're all going to die. That's not true. I mean, the interstate traffic may be a thousandth or a millionth of the bandwidth. Then you have banking, you have commercial, and 95% of all traffic are pictures of barbecues on WhatsApp or influencers that sell cosmetics. I mean, that's most of the traffic. So before you actually block interstate communication or wartime communication between countries, you need to cut a lot of cable because it's pretty easy to clean up traffic from influencers. Thank you. And I see another question. Do raise your hand because I saw two students at the top. Students very often stand at the back of the room, so it takes a while for them to get a microphone. And then, okay, you start, and then you. Yes, I have a question about well, in wartime situations, in two wars, there were a cutting off of the internet, and you pointed out there's no legislation to prosecute cable cutters, nor can you prosecute people who cut off the internet. I mean, we saw that when in Gaza there was no internet, you couldn't get pictures out of there. But in the matter of the rules of war, do you think that the cutting off the internet would be just as punishable as bombing a school or a hospital, or would you think that that would be a cause of war? I mean, just like in cyber defense, you recognize that some instances could be seen as self-defense. Yeah. Good evening. Oh, yeah. Yes, you're in the light. We can't see you. Yes. I'd like to thank you for this lecture. On item 2 in your presentation, you said that some players had access to sophisticated technology which enabled them to weaponize the space. And could you say a bit more about that? Also, I have a question. How did you, I mean, at the beginning, you mentioned the technological advantages, technological edges of some countries that do weaponize the space. All right, so we'll answer that and maybe a final round of question after that. So on resilience,
Yes, please.
General, thank you for the question. There are two things. As I was saying earlier on in the presentation, obviously you'll have countries with more resilience than others. Countries with less economic capacity, less economic resources haven't got much. They have cable and that's it. So if somebody comes along and cuts off a cable, they're done. Whereas France, Italy, Britain, the US, they have much more resilience. Having said that, there are 2 or 3 items that should be highlighted. It's not just the cutting off of cables. There's also interference with cables. So also infrastructure is not just a matter of destroying infrastructure, but also interference to the ends of economic advantage or jeopardizing a country's sovereignty, economic sovereignty. So there is a matter of resilience regarding the infrastructure. But if you look at data transmission cable for banking data, for instance, there are not that many of them. They haven't got that much resilience. So the issue is not so much a matter that you left without the internet and without WhatsApp, and that would be a tragedy. I would be lost without WhatsApp. It's not just that. It's the fact that you remain hostage to the political will of a hostile entity. I mean, you can have a malevolent entity that has decided to interfere or damage our economic or financial or day-to-day activities. So that's the internet. But if you look at the extent to which we depend on digital connection, this is accelerating faster than our own ability to develop resilience for the networks. So, which means that in the future we'll be more dependent and more vulnerable. At least that we will inevitably go through transition periods where there will be less resilience or less resilience capacity than we have now. Regarding sea underwater infrastructure, you mentioned the data centers that need to communicate. I mean, the main thing is to provide enough electricity supply to run the data centers. But if you generate enough electricity here, that will mean less for others, and some will be more vulnerable. In our own dependence is such that our resilience will simply not be able to keep up with the development of the capacity. Right. Look, you're right. It's true that communications or telecom in terms of for strategic areas may not be directly disrupted, but you have hostile forces that want to disrupt our societies, say disrupting social networks in the Mediterranean area at a critical time would have an effect on both sides of the Mediterranean. Yes, the issue of Gaza was a case in point. If you have a blackout on an issue of international interest, of course there will be social consequences. I make the point because this is one of the issues. My own wife was a former military. She went to Afghanistan, to Libya, and we spent years discussing the virtues of the rules of war. When you move from peacetime to wartime, regulations, it's a political move, and at least in some cases, when you move to these new spaces, what was yesterday considered innocuous can now be considered an act of war. The San Remo manual was updated. Well, it was more to do with humanitarian law and the implications of humanitarian law on operations. That is updated and revised on a regular basis. But here you're dealing with the very issue of whether you're moving from peacetime to wartime. And that's more a matter of judgment, of political judgment. It is a political choice. You interpret, you have a legal interpretation of facts from a different viewpoint. And that is a fundamental difference. Look, people, if you're interested in international humanitarian law, law of war, and maritime warfare, the real challenging point is to address those that are in centers of command or the legal apparatus to provide opinions that can help navigate the complex waters between law and politics. I mean, that is when we're talking about sub-threshold, there's a political choice to decide what is the threshold. I mean, you respond to the way in which you respond to any situation is a political decision with consequences in terms of responsibilities, in terms of continuity. And what was interesting over the past 2 months on the maritime affairs was to see the extent to which the American administration justified hunting down ships hit by U.S. sanctions. And there was a whole debate as to the legality of such maritime operations. So in what you have is a consistent or continuous legal interpretation. You tend to forget that the U.S. is not a party to UNCLOS and has its own views on the implementation of domestic law when it comes to hunting down stateless ships. Well, that, of course, is different from many other international players, including France or Britain. But this, in fact, is pretty consistent as far as the US is concerned. They are it's being perfectly consistent. And that calls into question the fact that you reach a point of complexity in international situations, especially in areas where you're not sure whether this is peacetime or wartime. And there, the connection between politics and international law is very difficult to decide. Now, there are issues that can be dealt with technically. Again, I was saying you can see an issue from both sides. There is a lot of dual-use technology, technology used in civilian space that could be used for other purposes, especially when you're looking at spaces of international confrontation. A case in point, the Houthis are better equipped at certain states. They have drones, they have limited missile capacity, and yet they can be a real challenge to to a significant portion of the international community. So there you have certain technology and the use of technology, or the military use of technology, has made it possible to certain players, non-state players, made it possible for them to suddenly have many more resources available to them. And if you look at the complexity of options, I mean, if you implement any military, any technological solutions, at the end is to be able to have as many options open, political options. And so in this context, you have some very sophisticated technologies that will make it possible for those states that do own the technology to have a wide variety of options in terms of international operations, which other states do not have. And the case in point is the US, but also China, obviously, and to some extent Russia, but for different reasons. But there you have countries that are in a position to have international clout because from a technological viewpoint, they can operations which not everybody can do, in fact, which hardly anybody can do. So over and beyond political considerations, from a technological standpoint, the operations conducted by the US in Venezuela is very impressive indeed. It took less time than the TV series. It took, in a matter of 3 hours, they actually were able to extract Maduro. He was on his way to the US. They prevented Russian systems from having any use at all because their own cyber capacity and moving across the spectrum, they had a capacity that other players simply do not have. And so technology makes a big difference. On the one hand, you have made more options accessible to countries that beforehand did not enjoy that many options. But at the same time, countries with more technological wherewithal had a greater lead against the rest of the world. I believe there's another question here. Pierre Levy. Yeah, I'd like to know what lessons you draw from a rather dramatic case, the Nord Stream sabotage. It happened in September 2022. There were some explanations in March or April the following year. It wasn't so much an economic issue because the pipes were not working anyway, but from a strategic viewpoint, that was a major shock. After all, this was an iconic project, albeit criticized. It was a political matter because you had countries accusing one another of having committed done the deeds, rather. In fact, people had seen a Russian boat sailing nearby, and as you pointed out, in some cases, all you need is a couple of good divers to conduct the operation. You have a security dimension, and then you have very complex legal dimensions because you had Germany involved, also Denmark and Sweden. There was a matter of jurisdiction, and so I don't know where we stand now. I don't know if we really want to know where we stand, but that's a sort of an open question on Nord Stream, and that could be. Well, thank you for, and yes, sir. And that will be the last question. Yes, well, I have a very simple question.
Alors, vous écoutez.
As we saw, some people can be very aggressive. When you want to be hostile to cables, you could well imagine a situation where a cable is cut off. So when you have cable carrying the internet with optic fibers, is that easy to fix, or does it take a long time? And if it takes a long time, what is done? Do you need to use the other cables to carry international traffic? Okay, thank you for that. And then the very last question, because we're running out of time. Sorry, I mean, yeah, it's you've been passed a few times. So yes, even looking only at the private domain and data transmission in terms of costs. What's better for data transmission, cable or satellite transmission? Oh yeah, and then a final sort of philosophical question: what of the resilience of the planet? You've you said that to manufacture chips in Taiwan, NVIDIA had to pay rice producers for the cooling water. I mean, you reach the limit of what you can do, isn't it? Right. Well, that was a very comprehensive overview. So repair and redistribute. He's good. The questions were very good, and the answers are excellent. All right. Data transmission cables. It takes anywhere between a week and 24 days on average to fix. If you for accidents for which we have data. So, and that is only a small portion, but that gives you an order of magnitude. It all depends also on where the problem occurred, whether there are ships out there that can fix the cables. So a data cable anywhere between 7 and 24 days, electricity cables between 40 and 60 days, and pipelines anywhere between 5 and 9 months. That's on average. So you do the math. You're talking about so Nord Stream. Repairing Nord Stream costs anywhere between 1.3 about 1.3 billion euros to fix Nord Stream. Just gives you an order of magnitude. So, data and electricity cables, on average, fixing that will cost you something like 200 million, upwards of 200 million. And that's just repairs. There was up there 65 billion euros of the British economy depends on the cables. So the cable we're using right now generates economic activity. And so if you have less cable available and you cannot divert traffic automatically, there will be some losses there. But then on top of that, you need to have it costs something to repair. But while the cables were unavailable, well, of course, that has an economic cost as well. So there's a lost earnings as well. So I mean, the only cost I mentioned was that of the repair itself, but there are other costs. Now, if you want to have a space versus satellite versus cable data transmission, I'll answer the last question last because I have a positive message. So, what's the best deal? I haven't been investigating this very thoroughly or very directly, but if you look at the situation now or 15 years down the road, you will find that capital expenditure in space will be less expensive than 5 years ago. What SpaceX can do today was unthinkable 10 years ago. So you can, so the cost will come down. Now, of course, the opaque nature of the underwater world is the very reason why there will be a cost to doing operations undersea, because the density is not the same. But there again, the technology will improve. But if you look at the ratio between capital expenditure and operating expenditure, if you look at the situation between satellite and cable, underwater cable, the gap will get smaller, will eventually be bridged. As to Nord Stream, how to allocate blame. To this day, blame has not been allocated. There are many reasons to believe that Russia was behind the trigger, but it's pretty difficult to lay the blame on Russia's doorstep. But then again, this is hardly surprising because allocating responsibility in the maritime domain is always challenging. Look at the Chornan the corvette that was torpedoed in North Korea. It's not as if you found the torpedo itself said with love from Kim. So there was no signature. There was an investigation conducted afterwards because, of course, the conditions being what they are underwater, and that takes us back to the matter of detecting things 1,000 meters down underwater. This is rather complicated. Nonetheless, a few lessons were learned. Allocation is critical. Of course, that is what makes it possible to decide whether you go from one technology to another. But of course, you use a technology, being exposed carries a political risk. So you have to see to what extent you can get away with it. And technology decides that. There was a case recently in Finland, but in France, after Nord Stream, we started. They started working on legislation to make it possible to prosecute these cases more effectively. But having said that, some types of actions are one shot. What I mean by that is Nord Stream. You can. I mean the sabotage operations you can do successfully once, but the next time around, of course, will be better prepared. And so, as was the case in Nord Stream, this was a matter of degrading and destroying the infrastructure itself. So it was an interesting case in point because, of course, it sent a shockwave, but also there was also confusion because this was pushing cooperation to the limit. There were different views in Europe, and of course there was Russian fake news, and we couldn't tell who was to blame. At some point, they wanted us to believe the Ukrainians were behind it. So there is a political clout and shock and confusion on the one hand. On the other hand, once you've done it once, it is much more difficult to pull it off a second time round. There's a limit as to how often you can repeat that side of operation and achieve the same objectives. Now, finally, the environmental dimension. PPNG.
Yeah.
BBNJ, I beg your pardon. That's the treaty for the protection of maritime areas in the high seas. There's a big issues about regarding the seabed because UNCLOS allows any countries to lay cables on the seabed. But the one thing in the BBNJ treaty is that I like the philosophical dimension because in philosophical terms, we've changed our understanding of the connection between the role of societies, the human dimension, and on the other hand, the duty to protect the sea. There's a new awareness that wasn't there 20 years ago, and that is what's behind most of the actions conducted at sea. I mean, when it comes to protecting the cables or semiconductors and such like, especially in Europe, we're well aware of the need to protect or respect the environment. So, of course, it's a collective responsibility. Unfortunately, not everybody is on the same wavelength when it comes to this sort of issue. There is a post-colonial dimension because, of course, the right to economic development is rooted in developing countries, and they have a different view on environmental protection. Having said that, I remain positive because, in spite of the great vulnerability of undersea spaces, we find that in Europe and in international institutions, such countries as France, Italy, Japan, countries with large exclusive economic areas, are heralds of environmental protection. So I think we can be positive there because while the issue of national security is critical on the geopolitical scene, and that is happening in a sort of a realpolitik context. Nonetheless, environmental protection remains within the conversation. Well, thank you for this positive note to end this session. You deserve a round of applause. And we'll see you next Monday with Jerry Laron.